The first thing Eleanor Hayes heard was the auctioneer calling her name like she was a horse. The sound cut through the hot June air of Abilene, Kansas, and left her standing cold in the middle of the town square. Men packed the wooden platform and the dusty street below it. Some looked curious. Some looked amused. Some did not bother to hide what they were thinking. Eleanor stood beside a weathered post with her hands locked so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned white. She tried to breathe, but every breath felt thin and sharp in her chest. Only 4 days ago, she had still been a married woman with a roof over her head and a name that carried a little respect. Now she stood in front of half the town because her husband had gambled away every dollar they had, borrowed more than he could ever repay, and then disappeared before dawn like a thief. He had left behind a signed note for the creditor, and in that note he had written the cruelest thing any man could write. He had written that his wife was part of the debt. Eleanor had read those words with her own eyes. Even now, she could still see the ink and the ugly slant of his handwriting. It had made her knees go weak when the sheriff came to the boarding house and handed the paper to the saloon owner. She had said there had to be some mistake. She had said a wife could not be sold like a chair or a mule. But the men around her had looked away, or looked sorry, or looked helpless. And now here she was. Next, the auctioneer shouted, sweeping his hand toward her, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, healthy, educated, respectable, and offered in settlement of her husband's lawful debt. We'll start at $70. A few men laughed. The shame burned so deep that Eleanor thought it might swallow her whole. She kept her chin up because she would rather die than let these people see her break, but inside she was already falling apart. Her husband, Walter, had once spoken to her like she was the finest woman in Missouri. He had promised her a good life out west. He had promised her land, a home, and a future. Instead, he had brought her to Kansas, taught her what hunger felt like, and then traded her away when his luck ran dry. 70, called a voice from near the front. 80. 90. Eleanor stared at the boards under her boots. She did not want to know who was bidding. She did not want to see which face might own her by the end of the morning. A hard wind moved across the square and lifted the edge of her plain blue dress. Dust stuck to her hem. Somewhere nearby a wagon rattled past, and the sound felt strange and cruel because the rest of the world kept moving while hers had stopped. 100, a new voice called. That voice was smooth, smug, and far too pleased with itself. Eleanor knew it belonged to Silas Boone, the owner of the Golden Spur Saloon. He was the man Walter had owed. He was broad through the belly, red in the face, and known all through Abilene for smiling when other men suffered. Eleanor had seen the way he looked at women. The thought of falling into his hands made sickness rise in her throat. 120, another man called. Silas snorted. 150. The crowd shifted and murmured. Eleanor pressed her nails into her palms until they hurt. This could not be happening. This could not be the end of her life, yet she knew it could. Women disappeared into hard places all the time. A boarding house kitchen, a back room in a saloon, a ranch where no one asked questions. Once she vanished into a man's power, there would be no one to come looking for her. Her parents were dead. Her only brother had been buried 2 winters ago in St. Louis. There was no family left to claim her. 175, Silas called again, louder this time, daring anyone to challenge him. Then another voice came from the edge of the crowd. 300. Everything went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Eleanor looked up before she could stop herself. A man stood near the hitching rail with one hand resting lightly on the saddle of a dark bay horse. He was tall and lean, with sun-browned skin and a gray hat pulled low over serious eyes. His shirt was faded from work and travel, and his boots were covered in trail dust. Nothing about him looked rich. Nothing about him looked foolish. Yet he had just offered more money than most men in town would see in months. Silas turned redder. 350. The stranger did not even blink. 500. A gasp ran through the square. Eleanor felt her heart slam against her ribs. $500. It was an impossible amount, too much for a whim, too much for mercy. No decent man would throw down that kind of money unless he wanted something in return. Silas hesitated. His jaw worked with anger. He glanced around, but no one stepped in to help him. At last he spat in the dirt and muttered something under his breath. The auctioneer lifted his hammer. Sold. The sharp crack of wood echoed in Eleanor's ears. The stranger handed over the money without ceremony. He took the folded paper from the auctioneer, glanced at it once, then tucked it into the inside pocket of his vest. After that, he stepped onto the platform and stopped a few feet from Eleanor. He did not reach for her. He did not smile in triumph. He only looked at her with a quiet steadiness that unsettled her more than open cruelty would have. "My name is Samuel Reed," he said. His voice was low and calm. It carried none of the rough humor or hunger she had heard from the others. Eleanor swallowed. "Are you taking me now?" A shadow crossed his face, as if the question pained him. "I'm taking you off this platform. After that, we're going somewhere private so we can talk." She did not know whether to trust him, but trust had nothing to do with it. She had no choice. He stepped aside and offered her room to walk ahead of him. That small act of courtesy felt so strange she nearly stumbled. The crowd parted as they came down from the platform. Eleanor could feel every eye on her. Some women looked pitying. Some men looked disappointed that the show was over. One or two looked almost ashamed. But none of them spoke. None of them stopped what had happened. Samuel led her across the street to the small hotel near the depot. Inside, the dining room was quiet in the late morning hour. He pulled out a chair and waited until she sat before taking the seat across from her. A young waitress came over, and he ordered tea for Eleanor and coffee for himself. Only when they were alone again did Eleanor find her voice. "You spent $500, she said. "No man does that for nothing." Samuel held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into his vest, removed the folded bill of sale, and placed it on the table between them. Eleanor stared at it. He tore it clean down the middle. Then he tore it again and again. He kept tearing until the paper was in small, ragged pieces scattered across the wood like pale leaves. "You are not property," he said. Eleanor forgot how to breathe. His words were simple, but they landed with such force that tears rushed to her eyes before she could stop them. She turned her face away, ashamed of crying in front of a stranger, but the tears kept coming. Not the helpless tears from the square. These came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere locked tight for too long. Samuel waited in silence until she could look at him again. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't have to understand it right away." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup but did not drink. "I was riding through town to buy supplies. I heard the crowd before I saw it. By the time I understood what was happening, they had already brought you onto the platform." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't going to stand there and let those men decide your future." "Why?" He looked down for a moment, then back at her. "Because once, years ago, no one stood up for my mother when she needed it. I was too young to stop what happened to her. I swore if I ever got the chance to do right by someone else, I would." The room felt very still. Eleanor studied his face, searching for a lie, but all she found was weariness and something honest that made her chest ache. The waitress returned with tea. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the warm cup even though they were still trembling. Samuel spoke again, careful and direct. "You are free to go wherever you choose. If you have family, I'll pay your fare and see you safely on a train." "I have no one," she said. He nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then I have another offer." She went still. "I own a ranch west of Dodge City. It's called Red Mesa. My aunt kept house for me until she passed last winter. Since then, things have been rough and half done. I could use help, cooking, cleaning, keeping order in the house. Honest work, fair wages. You'd have your own room, your own lock on the door, and your own pay at the end of every month. No one there will trouble you." Eleanor stared at him. "You would hire me?" "Yes. Just like that. Just like that." The tears threatened again. She fought them down. "Why would you trust me?" A faint sadness touched his mouth. "Why would you trust me?" For the first time that day, something close to a real feeling moved through her that was not fear. She looked down into her tea. The surface shook with the slight tremor in her hands. She had nothing. No home, no money, no place to sleep tomorrow if he walked away. The world had shown her this morning exactly what happened to women with no protection, and now one stranger sat across from her offering work instead of chains. It was madness. It was also hope. "When would we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow at first light," he said. "That gives you time to rest." Eleanor lifted her eyes to his. "And if I say yes?" Samuel leaned back slightly, giving her space even now. "Then tomorrow you leave Abilene behind." What? She let those words settle inside her. Leave Abilene behind. Leave the square, the stairs, the whispered shame, Walter's betrayal, and the worst day of her life. At last she drew a breath that reached all the way into her lungs. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll come." Samuel gave one small nod, and though his face barely changed, she saw relief in his eyes. "Then you have my word," he said. "No one will ever put you on an auction block again." That night Eleanor lay awake in the narrow hotel bed, listening to the sounds of the town outside the window, horses on the street, laughter from the saloon, a piano playing somewhere far off. Her body was exhausted, but her mind would not rest. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the platform again. She heard the bids. She felt the heat of strangers staring at her as if she were something to be priced and handled. Then she remembered another voice. "You are not property." She held onto those words in the dark like they were a rope thrown to a drowning woman. By dawn, her carpet bag was packed. When she stepped into the hotel lobby, Samuel Reed was already waiting by the door, hat in hand, ready to take her into a life she could not yet imagine. And Eleanor had no way of knowing that the man who had bought her freedom was carrying wounds of his own, or that the road ahead would bring danger neither of them expected. The morning sun had only just touched the rooftops of Abilene when Eleanor followed Samuel outside. Two horses waited by the boardwalk. One was a tall sorrel gelding with a white blaze down his face. The other was a calm little brown mare with gentle eyes and a worn leather saddle. Samuel took Eleanor's carpetbag and tied it behind the mare's saddle before turning to her. "This one is Daisy," he said. "She's easy to ride and not quick to spook." Eleanor rested her hand on the mare's neck. The horse's warmth settled something inside her. It had been years since she had ridden often, but the familiar smell of leather and dust brought back a part of herself she thought she had lost. Samuel adjusted the stirrup for her without a word and then stepped back. "Can you mount all right?" "Yes," she said, and with a little effort she swung herself into the saddle. He gave a short nod, as if pleased she still carried more strength than she knew. Then he mounted his own horse, turned west, and together they rode out of town. Eleanor did not look back at first. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the dry grass moving in the wind, on the narrow trail cutting through the open land. But once they reached the rise beyond the last buildings, she turned in the saddle and saw Abilene spread behind them in the morning light. It looked small from a distance. Small enough that she hated herself for letting it break her. Samuel did not hurry her. He kept his horse at an easy pace, letting Daisy lead when she wished. For the first hour they spoke little. The silence was not cold. It felt careful, almost kind, as if he knew her thoughts were still too bruised for conversation. By midday the land had opened into wide prairie broken by creek beds and stands of cottonwood. Wild grass rolled like water under the wind. The sky above them seemed endless. Samuel finally guided his horse toward a patch of shade near a stream. "We'll stop here and let them drink." Eleanor slid down from Daisy and her legs trembled when her boots hit the ground. Samuel pretended not to notice. He loosened the horse's reins and handed her a tin cup and a canteen. Then he unpacked bread, dried beef, and apples from his saddlebag. "You travel prepared," Eleanor said quietly. "I learned too," he replied. They sat on two flat rocks near the stream. For a while only the sound of moving water filled the space between them. Eleanor ate slowly, still not used to having food set before her without tension attached to it. After a time she looked at him. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" Samuel gave a faint smile. "Everywhere and nowhere. My father drove freight wagons most of my childhood. We moved from one territory to the next. I learned young or got left behind. Eleanor could picture it. A boy under big skies, sleeping by campfires, following rough roads through country that did not care whether a person made it through or not. "Did your father own land?" she asked. "No." His voice lost its small smile. "He never stayed long enough anywhere to build much of anything." "And your mother?" Samuel's gaze drifted toward the stream. "She died when I was 16. Eleanor remembered what he had said in the hotel. No one had stood up for her. She wanted to ask more, but something in his face told her the wound still sat close to the surface. So she did not push. Instead, she said, "I was born in St. Louis." That brought his eyes back to hers, a city woman. "I suppose I was once." A sad little smile touched her mouth. "My father sold dry goods. My mother played piano every evening after supper. We had a little brick house with blue shutters and a pear tree in the yard. I thought my life would always stay that way." Samuel listened without interrupting. "When they died, everything changed. My brother tried to keep us going, but he got sick. After he passed, there was no one left. Then Walter came along and spoke of a fresh start in the West." She looked down at her hands. He knew exactly what to say. Samuel's mouth hardened at Walter's name, but he stayed quiet. "I do not know when hope turned into fear," Eleanor went on. "Maybe it happened slowly. Maybe I simply refused to see it. The drinking, the cards, the debts, the lies. I kept thinking the man I married would come back if I waited long enough." Samuel's answer was gentle. "Some men spend their whole lives becoming less than they promised." She let that sit inside her. By late afternoon, they reached a small way station with a weathered porch and a lopsided barn. An older couple ran the place. Samuel rented a room for Eleanor and took the barn loft for himself without discussion. That, more than any promise, made her feel safe. After supper, she stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunset stain the prairie gold and red. Samuel leaned against a post a few feet away, hat low over his brow. "You can still change your mind," he said. She turned toward him. "About going with you?" "Yes." Eleanor studied him in the fading light. "Why would you say that now?" "Because once we reach Red Mesa, it may be harder to leave right away. The ranch is good land, but it's not near anything. I don't want you thinking you were carried into another kind of trap." His honesty struck her more deeply than sweet words ever could have. "I don't think that," she said. He looked at her then, straight and steady. "Good." The next 2 days carried them farther west into rougher country. The flat prairie gave way to red hills, dry washes, and tall stone ridges that glowed under the sun. The air smelled different there. Cleaner somehow, sharper. Eleanor felt each mile place more distance between herself and the woman on the platform in Abilene. Riding returned to her body faster than she expected. By the second day she sat straighter and guided Daisy with more confidence. Once, while crossing a shallow creek, the mare stumbled on loose stone. Eleanor caught herself quickly, but Samuel was beside her in an instant. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, breathless. His hand stayed lightly at her elbow for only a second before he stepped back. "Good." That brief touch stayed with her longer than it should have. That evening they camped beneath a line of cottonwoods. Samuel built a neat fire and cooked beans in a blackened pot while Eleanor spread blankets on the ground. The stars came out slowly, bright and endless. "It's beautiful," she whispered before she could stop herself. Samuel glanced up at the sky. "Yes." "No," she said, looking past the fire into the dark open land. "All of it." For the first time she saw something soften fully in his face. The next morning they rode into a broad valley ringed by red stone bluffs. A creek ran clear through the grass, and beyond it, set against a rise dotted with mesquite and cedar, stood a large ranch house with a deep porch, a bunkhouse, 2 barns, a corral, and smoke lifting from a chimney. Samuel lifted a hand toward it. "That's Red Mesa." Eleanor slowed Daisy and stared. It was not grand in the way rich Eastern homes were grand, but it was solid, strong, built to last. The kind of place made by hands instead of show. As they rode into the yard, a man in his 40s came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, and moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he stood. "That's Ben Carter," Samuel said. "My foreman." A woman followed Ben onto the porch, tying back her apron as she came. She had warm brown eyes and silver beginning at her temples. "And that is his wife, Ruth." Ruth came down the steps before Eleanor had even fully dismounted. "You must be tired clear through," she said. "Come inside. There's stew on the stove and clean water heating." The simple kindness in her voice nearly undid Eleanor. Samuel carried her carpetbag to the house, but instead of leading her to some servant's corner, he showed her to a small room at the back with its own narrow bed, white curtains, a braided rug, and a little dresser with a basin set out fresh. "I hope this will do for now," he said. Eleanor turned slowly, taking it in. Someone had placed a small jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. Samuel nodded once. "Rest this evening. We can speak about work tomorrow." When he left, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands to her face. She had expected hardship. She had expected caution. She had even expected to regret coming here. She had not expected gentleness. That first week at Red Mesa passed with a strange, quiet peace. Ruth showed her the kitchen stores, the linen cupboard, and the routines of the house. Ben treated her with simple respect, no questions asked. The ranch hands tipped their hats and kept their distance. No one looked at her the way the men in Abilene had. Samuel was often out before sunrise, checking cattle, riding fence, meeting with suppliers. Yet every evening he returned to the house for supper, and every evening he thanked Eleanor for the meal as if she had done him a great favor. Little by little, she began to breathe easier. Then one afternoon, as she shook out fresh sheets on the back line, Ben came riding hard into the yard. Samuel was with him, and the look on both men's faces sent fear straight through her. Samuel dismounted fast. "Eleanor, get inside." Her heart lurched. What happened? Before he could answer, a second rider appeared at the edge of the yard. Even from a distance, Eleanor knew the shape of him. Walter. Her husband had found her. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know." For one long second, Eleanor forgot how to move. Walter Hayes rode into the Red Mesa yard like he had every right in the world to be there. Dust covered his coat, and his face looked thinner than before, but nothing could hide the careless selfishness she knew too well. He pulled his horse to a stop and looked from Eleanor to Samuel with a twisted little smile. "Well," he said, "seems my wife landed on her feet." Samuel stepped forward, putting himself between Walter and the porch. His voice was quiet, but it carried like iron. "You need to turn around and ride back the way you came." Walter gave a short laugh. "That's a fine greeting from the man keeping another man's wife." Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest, but it was no longer shame. It was anger, clean and sharp. "I am not your wife in any way that matters," she said. Walter's eyes slid toward her, and she saw surprise there. He had expected fear. He had expected the broken woman he left behind in Abilene. He did not find her. He found someone standing straight. "You ought to come here, Eleanor," he said, like he was calling a stubborn child. "This whole little play has gone on long enough." Samuel did not move, but something in him changed. The air around him seemed to tighten. "She won't be going anywhere with you." Walter's mouth hardened. "You bought what was mine. I've come to settle that." Ben took one step closer from the barn. Ruth stood in the doorway, pale but steady, one hand pressed to her chest. The ranch hands had begun to gather at a distance, silent and watchful. Eleanor came down from the porch before anyone could stop her. "Nothing about me was ever yours to sell," she said. Walter stared at her as if the words themselves offended him. "You wore my name. That makes you my concern." "No," Eleanor said. "It made me your responsibility, and you failed it." A flicker of meanness crossed his face. "Careful, Ellie." She had not heard that name from his mouth in months, and now she hated it. Samuel spoke without taking his eyes off Walter. "State your business and be done with it." Walter drew himself up in the saddle. Fine. I heard where she'd gone. I heard you paid 500 for her. So here is how this works. You give her back or you pay me what she's worth now that she's settled in." Ben let out a sound of disgust. Eleanor felt the world narrow to Walter's face and the filth of his words. Even now, after everything, he still spoke as if she were something to be traded from one man to another. Samuel's voice dropped lower. "You should leave before you make this worse." Walter leaned down slightly in the saddle and his eyes turned ugly. "Or what? You'll shoot a man for coming after his own wife." Samuel's hand never moved toward his gun, but every man in the yard knew he did not need to. "I won't have to. Because if you stay another minute, the sheriff from Dodge will hear exactly how you sold a woman over a gambling debt and came here to do it again." That struck home. Walter's eyes shifted. For the first time, Eleanor saw uncertainty in him. He covered it fast with anger. "You think anyone will care?" "I do," came Ruth's voice from the doorway. Ben stepped up beside Samuel. "And so do I." One by one, the others in the yard moved closer. None of them said much. They did not need to. Walter looked around and realized what he had never understood in all his life. There were men here who knew the difference between strength and cruelty. He was outnumbered, and worse, he was outmatched. Still, Walter was not done. Men like him rarely were. He looked at Eleanor again, and this time his smile was small and poisonous. "You think this man is different. Men are all the same in the end. He bought you same as I sold you." The words hit hard because once, not long ago, they would have sunk deep into her. Now they did not. Eleanor lifted her chin. "No. He bought my freedom, then he gave it back, a thing you were never man enough to understand." Walter's face changed. The charm fell away fully, leaving only bitterness. Samuel took one step forward. "Get off my land." For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought Walter might reach for his gun out of spite, pride, or simple stupidity. The yard went still. Even the horses seemed to sense it, but Walter's hand stayed where it was. He looked around once more, saw no path for himself, and spat into the dirt. "This isn't finished," he muttered. "It is for here," Samuel said. Walter yanked his reins hard enough to make his horse toss its head. Then he turned and rode out of the yard without another word. Eleanor stood frozen until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the open land. Only then did her knees weaken. Samuel turned at once and caught her before she could fall. His hands were firm and warm at her arms. "I've got you." For one terrible second, all the fear she had held back came crashing through her. She shook so hard she could barely stand. Samuel guided her to the porch steps and sat beside her while Ruth brought water. No one crowded her. No one told her she was foolish. They simply stayed near. After a while, when the worst of the shaking passed, Samuel spoke softly. "He won't come back alone next time. Men like that don't know when they're beaten." Eleanor stared at the yard where Walter had stood. "Then what do we do?" Samuel hesitated, and she turned to look at him. He was not a man who reached for words without care. She had learned that. So when he spoke, she knew every part of it mattered. "We make sure he has no legal hold over you," he said. "In Dodge City, there's a judge I trust and a lawyer who owes me a favor. If Walter tries to claim you again, we end it the right way. Permanent." Her heart beat harder for a different reason now. "You would do that?" Samuel's eyes held hers. "I would do anything needed to keep you safe." The yard, the house, the people around them all seemed to fade for a moment. Eleanor saw only him. This man who had entered her life on the worst day she had ever known and never once asked for more than she wished to give. This man whose strength was never loud, whose kindness never came with a price. Something long silent inside her finally found its voice. "I am tired of being afraid," she said. Samuel's expression softened. "Then don't carry it alone." 3 days later, they rode into Dodge City with Ben beside them and papers ready. Walter had not expected them to come after him through the law. He had expected hiding, fear, maybe pleading. Instead, he was dragged into a lawyer's office in front of witnesses and made to answer for what he had done. The signed note he left in Abilene was enough to damn him in the judge's eyes. So were the debts. So was the testimony of the auctioneer, who suddenly found his conscience when talk of criminal charges began to spread. Walter blustered. He lied. He claimed misunderstanding, but his face lost more color with every page placed before him. At last the lawyer set down the final document. A legal separation, full surrender of claim, and divorce proceedings to be completed without contest. Walter looked up at Eleanor with hate burning in his eyes. "You ruined me for this." She met his stare without trembling. "You ruined yourself." The judge ordered him to sign. His hand shook when he did it. When they stepped back outside into the bright afternoon sun, Eleanor stopped on the wooden sidewalk and closed her eyes. Wind moved gently through the street, carrying dust and the smell of horses and summer heat. Free. This time the word was real in every way. She opened her eyes and found Samuel watching her, not with pride, not with possession. Only with quiet relief, like a man who had been holding his breath for days and could finally let it go. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she whispered, "it's done." They stood there a moment longer while Ben tactfully looked the other way near the hitching post. Then Samuel said, "There's one more thing." Something in his voice made her heart begin to race. He took off his hat and held it in both hands. For a man so steady in all things, he looked almost uncertain now. "I had planned to wait," he said. "I told myself you had been through too much, and I would give you all the time in the world." Eleanor could hardly breathe. "But I don't want you to doubt what this is, and I don't want another day to pass without saying it plain." His eyes did not leave hers. "I love you, Eleanor." The words hit her with the force of a sunrise after a long winter. Samuel went on, voice low and true. "I loved you before Walter rode into my yard. I loved you when you stood your ground against him. I love the way you brought peace back into that house. I love your courage and your gentleness, and the way you keep going after life has given you every reason to stop." Tears blurred her vision. He stepped closer. "You do not need my name to survive. You have already proven that. But if you want it, if you want me, then I would be honored to spend the rest of my life earning your trust." And there, on the busy street in Dodge City, Samuel Reed dropped to one knee. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, "will you marry me?" The whole world seemed to hold still. Eleanor looked at the man before her, not a rescuer standing above her, not an owner making a claim. Just a good man offering his heart with open hands. "Yes," she whispered. Then stronger, with tears running freely now, "Yes, Samuel, I will." He rose so fast she laughed through her crying, and when he gathered her into his arms, the years of fear and grief seemed to loosen all at once. His kiss was gentle, almost reverent, like a vow spoken without words. They were married that autumn at Red Mesa beneath a wide blue sky and trees just turning gold. Ruth cried through half the ceremony. Ben smiled like a man trying hard not to. The ranch hand stood scrubbed clean and proud as if the day belonged to all of them. Eleanor wore a simple cream dress Ruth had helped sew by hand. Samuel wore his best dark coat and looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world worth seeing. When he spoke his vows, his voice shook only once, and that was when he promised this. "No harm will ever reach you without first coming through me, but more than that, no sorrow will ever find you without me standing beside you." Eleanor's own vow came from the deepest place in her heart. "You gave me freedom when the world took it from me. You gave me kindness when I had forgotten it existed. I will spend my life giving that love back to you." The years that followed became the life she once believed was forever lost. The house at Red Mesa filled with laughter, warm bread, muddy boots by the door, and children with Samuel's steady eyes and Eleanor's quiet smile. In spring, they rode the far pasture together while the grass came in green. In summer, they sat on the porch after sunset with coffee in their hands and peace around them. In winter, they kept close to the fire while wind moved over the land outside and the little one slept down the hall. Sometimes, on rare quiet evenings, Eleanor would think back to the auction block in Abilene. She would remember the fear, the heat, the sound of strange men naming prices over her life. The memory never fully vanished, but it no longer owned her. One evening many years later, she and Samuel sat side by side on a hill above Red Mesa, while the sky burned orange behind the red bluffs. Their youngest had just fallen asleep against Samuel's shoulder before he carried the child back to the house. Eleanor watched him return through the fading light, still broad-shouldered, still steady, still the man who had changed the course of her life with one impossible act of decency. When he sat beside her again, she slipped her hand into his. "You bought my freedom," she said softly, "but what you truly gave me was myself." Samuel turned and kissed her temple. "No," he said, "you found yourself. I was only lucky enough to be there when you did." Below them, the lights of the ranch glowed warm in the deepening dusk. Home. Real home. Not built on promises or lies, but on trust, courage, and a love that had begun in the middle of humiliation and risen into something strong enough to outlast every shadow behind it. And in all the years to come, whenever people told the story of Red Mesa, they did not speak of the day a woman was sold. They spoke of the day she was set free, and of the cowboy who offered not a claim but a choice, and how she chose love,